recording and filming are not allowed. Thank you for your cooperation.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for attending the second lecture of the 30th Qin Wu Lecture in History and Culture of New Asia College. To enhance academic and cultural exchanges, the New Asia College of CUHK has been organizing the Qin Wu Lecture in History and Culture since 1978. Every year, a distinguished scholar will be invited to deliver a series of public lectures exploring topics on Chinese history and culture. This year, we have great honor to have invited Professor Benjamin Elman, the Gordon Wu 58 Professor of Chinese Studies, as well as Professor of East Asian Studies and History in Princeton University. Today, Professor Elman is going to give us a talk on the Great Reversal, China, Korea, and Japan in the early modern world, 1590s to 1890s. We are also very delighted to have Professor Leung Yun Sang, Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Professor of History of CUHK, to be the moderator of this lecture. So, without further delay, I will now pass over to Professor Leung to introduce the speaker and start the lecture today. Thank you very much.
Professor Elman and ladies and gentlemen, I am very delighted, I think, on behalf of the New Asia College and also Chinese University of Hong Kong and the Hong Kong Public Library System as well, who co-organized this public lecture today. I'd like to welcome all of you to attend today this afternoon lecture by our distinguished, Chen Wu visiting scholar Professor Elman. Professor Elman is Gordon Wu 58 Professor of Chinese Studies, as well as Professor of East Asian Studies and History at Princeton University. I think he has been there for 15 years, I think. Before that, I think he had taught for another 15 years at UCLA and also Rice University, all quite well-established top universities in the world. And Professor Elman is one of the my most admired scholars in the field of Chinese studies. He has written several monographs, research monographs and books on late imperial Chinese history, from philology, I think, to philosophy to philology, his first book. And then also, I have also read, I think, his really big volume on civil service examination, and more recently, I think, his book on Chinese science and technology, and also in the same period. He has lately maybe focused his research in a cultural communication and interaction between Japan, China, and Korea, East Asia, I think, in the pre-modern world. So today he's going to present, I think, his views, and I think he has some very interesting, challenging ideas, I think, in this interesting topic, focusing on interrelations between China, Japan, and Korea. Now, I think without much ado, I think I would like you, all of you, to give a big round of applause to welcome Professor Elman.
Thank you for that very kind introduction. Thank you all for coming. Let me thank a number of people first. I want to thank President Yong-Yen Tsang for his introduction and his kind remarks. He's the director of the Institute of Chinese Studies. Henry Wong, I thank him a second time for his support of this lecture. I gave a talk yesterday, and he also came to the dinner. I want to thank Henry for his support. I want to thank Lai Ming Chiu for this kind of event as well. Thank you very much. And I would like to thank Chong Shi Yu for the introduction at this time. Most importantly, I should thank Dr. C.S. Chan. His money makes this all possible. His contributions make this possible. I think we often forget that someone can have an academic degree in finance and also support the humanities, history, and literature. I think that's a very important thing to do. So I think we should give Professor Yu's opinion, Treasure Xin Xin, we should give a hand for his support. Yesterday I had about 1,500 undergraduates listen to my lecture. They were forced to listen to my lecture. They didn't come optionally. They had to be brought in by Xinyan, Shuyan, Yuanjia, and others to listen to my talk. And I was surprised that they stayed the whole time. They asked some very good questions. So I was very pleased with that result. You will be much more difficult crowd to please, since you have come optionally, and you also leave optionally if the lecture is worth anything to itself. I think we want to make sure that we thank yesterday's students for their contributions. And yesterday I talked about history to the students in such a way that I emphasized sources and materials, the use of sources and materials in different languages. And I think they understood that when you do research in history, you have to have evidence, you have to have materials, you have to have theories and ideas. You need to put them all together as best as possible. Today what I'm going to try to do, and then in the next lecture, the last lecture on the 8th, is undo that story and indicate that in many ways facts do not always appear as they seem, that history is filled with images, and many of those images are not truthful images, they're problematic images, and we need to be careful about them. The picture I'm showing you on the front of the paper is from Punch, a humorous magazine in England published in the 18th, 19th, 20th century. This was for the Sino-Japanese War of 1894-95. You can see the giant Wang representing the Chinese, the little samurai, the shrimpish samurai representing Japan, and the English observer, the gentleman public, observing a war. And from this you would think that the Japanese are all shrimps, and that the Chinese are all giants, and that the old metaphors of biblical story making, that the giant will be beaten by the smaller, nimbler enemy, is a true story. This is a borrowing of that biblical story that David and Goliath met many, many centuries ago. I would suggest to you that it's not the proper metaphor to use. It's humorous, it's funny, but in many ways it also leads astray. Now, more recently, historians have begun to recognize that we are subject to optical and cognitive illusions. We see things and we think that we see what is actually there, when in fact we're under the influence of those who are making the presentations and those who are dealing with these presentations. The American post-Trump elections are very much like that now. People are trying to perceive what is the truth, what is false, what are facts, what are events, and how do we put them all together. And I must say, to our credit, those of us who have operated in postmodern studies are responsible for creating a new kind of hawkishness that uses postmodern ideas to justify itself. And so I think we want to be very careful about how that works out in different kinds of ways. But I would like to argue that in many ways the previous image is an optical illusion. And to continue that optical illusion, we can begin to see the results with the shrimpish samurai sitting atop David Goliath and defeating the Qing dynasty by the reigning Meiji state of that period of time. This is how it was, and what we see from this is the fall of the giant and the rise of the shrimp, the rise of the little Japanese. And we will see that there are many images of the little Japanese that the Japanese are going to refute and argue, we are not small any longer, we are not short, we are the leaders of Asia, and we will be leaders of the world. And indeed, after 1895, that came true with a vengeance in China, in the United States, in Pearl Harbor, and in portions of Asia as well. So I'm going to be talking about some of these images, and I would say that there was no battle between samurai and giants, and no victory by samurai and giants, but there was a war that was fought in 1894-95, in which the Japanese defeated the Qing Dynasty Navy and forces out of Korea, and as a result of that, we see those worlds in different ways. But Korea, China, Japan had fought many times over Korea. The war in 1894-95 may have been the third or fourth time. And we see the episode today in the 21st century as being the most recent episode of these conflicts that they have faced in the past. So these images are both old and new, but they are always informing a contemporary world within which China, Korea, and Japan can't get enough of each other. They are stuck with each other in a geographical miasma, and they have to deal with it accordingly. The mapping, of course, I think you all know very carefully. Korea juts from the Asian mainland into Japan, and also the sea leads very clearly into Port Arthur, southern Shandong province, and the Liaodong Peninsula. This will be a key area for industrial growth, industrial wealth, and manufacturing, and this will be somewhere that all Europeans want, that all Japanese and Chinese want as well, and there'll be a battle fought over these arenas. And the first will be the 1894-95 war, and the second will be the Russo-Japanese War theater, where Russia and Japan fought over Korea, with the Chinese watching on the sidelines. And how that happened and what goes on is problematic. As a historian, I will not tell you what will happen with the current battles with Korea and the battles and problems with China and Japan. But I will say they are a repeat, reconfiguration of things that have happened in the past. They go back to the Tang Dynasty, go back to the Ming and Qing Dynasty, and we have to take that into account to understand Chinese loyalism to Korea and Korea's loyalism to China over the centuries, over the millennia. They have been towering allies against enemies from Manchus to Japanese and others. Now, we have some remnants of the pictures of the war at that time. These were filmed by the Japanese, of course. They were the winners. And so they showed their ships destroying the Qing Navy in 1894-95. This was called the Zhao Zhanzhang. And you can see these are modern steamships, modern navies that had been introduced by the Europeans in the 19th century. And now the Japanese are using them against the Chinese, and you will see that the Chinese are also able to use a new modern navy to fight up against each other. I want you to watch the films as they change. First, it's all Japanese cannons firing at will, making progress. And you can see the Chinese ships being bombed. But note that they are not junks. They are not traditional ships. They are modern fleet, filled with arms of their own and filled with modern shipping of very, very critical state. Here's a good picture of one of the Qing Navy ships, and you can see that it is a modern navy. So that in 1894-95, when China and Japan fought, two modern navies faced each other. And in the battle, the Chinese lost and the Japanese won. And the Japanese recorded that feature in these films. So as the end, we see the end of this film with the Chinese ships being blown up and the Japanese ships going on to victory at Galilee and elsewhere. And this is a modern war, and it's being fought between China and Japan, modeled after perhaps the wars with the Europeans in the North Atlantic and elsewhere later on. The next war that the Japanese recorded was the Russo-Japanese War. The Russo-Japanese War was fought over Liaodong. The Japanese had wanted Liaodong from the very start, but then many ways later, the Russians, the French, and the Germans forced the Japanese to give up Liaodong and take Taiwan instead. One of the unknown stories is, of course, that Japan got Taiwan, but they really wanted Liaodong. They really wanted Manchuria, and the Russians and the French and the Germans allied against the Japanese in 1895 to take that away from the Japanese. They were forced to give it up. The Chinese paid more money for the give up, but in many ways, the Japanese then saw the Russians as their enemies. The Japanese saw the Russians as their enemies. And in the 1904-1905 war, which we have a brief clip on, you can see what happened with a good deal of money from the Qing Dynasty that the Japanese used to build a better, stronger navy. Give an idea of the guns that are on the ships. But watch carefully how in 10 years, power has multiplied many times over. The guns on the ships are very powerful and more plentiful. The long-distance Russian ships are being destroyed. Here is a typical Japanese destroyer attacking attacking the Russians this time, destroying their major fleet. And here, the pinnacle of power in these ships. We are now into the world of World War II. This is beginning to enter from World War I to World War II, with shipping and navies ruling the seas, making possible different states controlling different areas. And to this very day, the Russians and the Japanese are not at peace. They have never signed a treaty, and each wants something from the other to have a peace that will go on. So while there's no peace with the North Koreans, there's no peace between the Japanese and the Russians either as a result of these earlier periods of time. And that sits in the background of our talks and discussions, and we have to recognize that it's a complicated problem, and not just North Korea is part of the problem, but the relations between China, between Russia, and Japan are part of the problem. Now, where did the money come for the Japanese ships? A good deal came from the Qing money collected after the victory by Japan over the Qing dynasty. Losers of wars had to pay for them. When Germany lost wars in the 20th century, it had to pay. Similarly, when France was defeated by Germany in 1870, the French had to pay. Money was withdrawn to pay for new escapades in warfare. And the rise of the Japanese Navy increased because it used money from the Qing dynasty, money from China and elsewhere to build the new Navy that they would need to take on the United States in the Pacific. Make no mistake, the Japanese early on decided they were fighting for control of the Pacific Ocean, the whole banana. Now, many of the ships that later joined the fleet to defeat the Russians were actually Qing dynasty late imperial ships that had been purchased either from Europe or built in Fuzhou, built in Shanghai, built in Guangzhou, built in Port Arthur and other places. And you can see that they were all modern ships. The French Matsushima was also built in Europe. It was the fastest ship of the time, and ultimately enabled the Japanese to defeat first the Qing fleet, and then later the French, later the Russian fleet. Here's a Barrow warship that was available at that time. Barrow is in England. It now makes submarines, nuclear submarines and the like. And so the arms race has continued in these families of weapon producers, ship producers, and ultimately new kinds of weapons in this period of time. Both China and Japan bought a number of the Barrow warships from England to use in the battles that followed in the 19th century. And we see a militarization through navies in this time that seems somewhat unique, and it is in terms of power, but these battles had occurred before. Again, the images of the ships are modern ships in a modern war. We see no images of backward Chinese or backward Russians. We see their ships being destroyed by very powerful Japanese forces. Here's the 4,150-ton cruiser. It doesn't look like much now, but in 1894-95, this was a powerful ship. 1904-1905, it was powerful, and you could see some of the remnants of what it could produce in the films that I've mentioned. The Second Sino-Japanese War turns out to have been the first major naval battle employing steam-powered fleets. In other words, the Europeans had never fought such a war. When France and England fought in the 1870s, it was a land war. It was not a sea war for the most part. And so the rise of the Western navies were obvious, but no one knew what kinds of ships would be at the advantage in the coming times. And so everyone looked to the war between China and Japan to see whose navy would win and why. And it turned out that the Japanese Navy won, and it turned out that it won because their ships were faster. They could handle the seas better. And the Chinese ships and the Russian ships were big, strong, and powerful, but awkward, less maneuverable. And so people learned very quickly that one had to learn how to build faster, nimbler ships to fight against each other, or else all was lost. That great ships like the Bismarck of the Germans would be blown to ashes by smaller destroyers that had special kinds of weapons attached to them. And one of those weapons was torpedoes. The torpedoes that small ships would aim at the big ships and destroy their hulls and make them sink all at once. And this great weapon of torpedoes required destroyers to destroy the torpedo ships so that warfare would be equalized again. I won't go through this detail of this record here, but we begin to see that in September 17th, when the Chinese and the Japanese first fought, each had 12 ships in the clash. The Chinese had bigger, heavier ships, and the Japanese had faster, nimbler ships, and the nimbler, faster ships won. I bore you with these facts because that's what was learned from the warfare of that period of time, and new navies were constructed using these new standards and new models. One of them should be very familiar to all of you. If you go to your Maritime Museum of Hong Kong, the Hong Kong Coastal Defense Fortress, here is one of the major torpedoes. It looks like a modern weapon, and of course it is. You can visit it at the end of the Beijiao, at the end of the road there. You have the museum there, and you'll see that they have these torpedoes to protect Hong Kong Harbor from the coming Japanese that would come in later in the 30s, 40s to try to conquer Hong Kong. So these weapons were touching Hong Kong, and in many ways the fate of Hong Kong was at stake in these new battles, and of course we know that the Japanese also attacked and occupied Hong Kong in the warfare of the period of time. So these weapons were beginning to take prominence in their technologies and the efforts to deal with these technologies. And all were doing this, and the so-called torpedo boats became the new weapon of choice as a result of the wars out at sea. This is what the warfare had looked like in the 15th and 16th century in peaceful Japan. There were, at that time, castles in the seas, but the ships were simply fishing ships of locals, and the Japanese didn't need much of a fleet to win the battles that they faced against the land forces in Japan in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century. There was a craze in Europe in the late 19th century for Monet clothing. Arts and things like that were very valuable in this period of time, and so there was a beginning after the war of honoring Japan, thinking of Japan as the model new East Asian state, and in many ways praising Japan for accepting new forms of warfare, new forms of modern organization, and moving forward to catch up with the Europeans. The ships were painted white, supposedly, and black for those that were the bad guys. The Japanese ships were the good guys, and the Japanese and the Chinese black ships were the bad guys. And you can see that in these battles, these are paintings, these are movable prints, woodblock prints that are showing the warfare of that time, and they have used traditional artistic records to show how the Chinese vessels were destroyed, what happened to all the men on board, and ultimately how the powerful Japanese forces defeated the Qing Navy at sea. It seems obvious. In hindsight, it looks like the Japanese couldn't have lost and that the Chinese couldn't have won. But nobody thought that in 1894-95. They only began to think that way in 1895-96 when the results made people realize what was at stake. And one of the things we want to do as historians is to see things not only as they became, but how they got there. And if we look at how they got there, in 1890, 1894, no one knew what would happen. And many bet that the Qing Navy, because it was larger and stronger, had bigger ships and more manageable troops, that they would defeat the Japanese much more easily. It turned to the opposite. Even the Japanese didn't expect to win. They themselves, the emperor, stayed very quiet until he was sure victory was available, and then he began to gather the crowds in the streets of Tokyo to honor the brave men at sea and on land in conquering Korea, taking over the Yamato Peninsula, and ultimately being sent to Taiwan to take over Taiwan. So the story is generally clear. I think all of you know it. You are taught the story in grammar school, you are taught the story in middle school, you are taught the story in college, and you are being taught by your graduate mentors as well how this all worked. And it seems like the inevitability of the rise of Japan and the strength of Japan is an obvious story. I don't want anyone to leave the room here to say that Elman argued that the Japanese lost the war. I want no one to say that the Chinese won the war. 100% of us should agree the Japanese won the war and that the Chinese lost the war, but the reasons that happened are debatable. And we want to ask ourselves, what was the role, what was the issue? Did Confucianism fail China? Did the samurai tradition of the small samurai fighting the great David, was that the difference? What was the real difference between the rise of Japan and the fall of China? The rise of Japan has been our story about the world history of East Asia in the 19th and 20th century, and the decline of China. Two important narratives, the rise of Japan and the fall of China, are part of this reckoning of what happened on the battlefield at sea and on land. And in this record, painted by the Japanese on their own woodblock prints, gives the obvious reason power mattered. The Japanese had power, even though their ships were really smaller, faster, and nimbler. They are meant to appear here as huge ships in drawings, but in fact they were much smaller at that time. What happened to the Japanese dwarfs? The Japanese images of themselves were no longer of dwarfs. They were of giant officers who didn't bow at all. The Qing and Manchus and Chinese must bow before the new Japanese elites, and they became small. They sat on the ground, and the Japanese taunted them for their weaknesses and their powerlessness in this drawing. Why would the Japanese suddenly become giants? Why would they all look like Europeans in this context? And we know that images are being constructed and used to present the victory of the Japanese over the Manchus and the Chinese navies, and later victory over the land forces in Pyongyang, in Korea at that time as well. This is how this is being presented to the Japanese audiences in this period of time. The superior Japanese wearing European uniforms that learned the new arts of war, and when they went into battle, they wore white tents, their tents were white, and no one got dirty. Warfare was automatic, and you were victorious without any problems. This is the way it was made to seem in terms of inevitability and storyline. Some of that had been learned in the 1850s when American troops came to Japan in the 1850s in this period of time. And they saw the Americans well organized in naval organizations, whereas the Japanese didn't quite know what to make of it in the 1850s and sort of began to learn more and more about Western warfare and the order required for a navy going into battle at this period of time. The Perry expedition, for example, was the major feature that opened up Japan in the 1850s. It had been very important in China as well, in getting the trading mechanisms open in Hong Kong and the treaty ports in Macau and elsewhere. So people were learning quite quickly what it took to win battles, to win on the battlefield of warfare and economy, of society and culture. The Japanese troops were near Yalu in 1904 against the Russians, and we have pictures of them that seem to tell us they didn't get to wear their own pants all the time. They got dirty. They had to work for their jobs. They had to make a living at it. And here, in many ways, they're talking to an American adventurer who's been wandering through northern Yalu Peninsula, watching the Japanese rise and take the area from the Russians. Here's a picture of Japanese officers used during the Sino-Japanese War of 1894-95, and you can see they are not giants. They are short, of course, but they are also getting larger, getting taller, and are more prominent in their fields. We could have pictures of the Chinese officers. They would be wearing gowns, gowns that the Qing warriors wore in this period of time. So the gowns of the Qing is compared to the new kinds of dressing styles of the soldiers at sea and on land in 1904. We have pictures of the Japanese infantry to verify what happened in addition to what happened with the ships. And we have perhaps the most famous image that has survived, the decapitation of violent Chinese Manchu soldiers in 1894. This was for Japanese consumption only. It was to punish those Chinese and Manchus who had not settled for not making trouble. They made a great deal of trouble for their Japanese controllers, and the Japanese said, we will execute all the troublemakers, and in front of the soldiers, they will all learn their place, they'll all learn what is going on, and they will thereafter have to learn from Japan. This new Japan was a very violent Japan, and also didn't have a notion of human rights, prisoners of war, which were being debated about in the late 19th and early 20th century. No. In many ways, the Japanese treated the Chinese and the Manchus with the powerful victims narrative. They were slated to be destroyed. Later, when they fought against the Russians, they made exceptions and tried to pretend that they were humanists, that they were trying to give the Russian soldiers and naval soldiers help and support them and protect them before they were sent back to their homes. So over time, the Japanese became kinder to their white constituencies of prisoners and continued to teach their yellow constituencies that might makes right, and if you get in our way, we will eliminate you. We will cut your head off in front of your own compatriots, in front of your own equals. When this was shown in 2006 to students in Boston, at Harvard and at MIT, there were small protests that eventually grew into large protests for these being presented without commentary or discussion. And people began to look at this and say, what is really going on here? And what is Japan really doing here? Are these warfares entitled, or are these warfares in many ways that are built on the dirty backs of a whole range of problems that come up in this period of time? So we begin to see this image in 2006 began to appear very differently than it does even now, today, in public. I show it to you not because I'm in favor of it or against it or think that it's a false picture or a correct picture. I give it to you because this was the picture presented to the Japanese community by a Japanese state to augment its power and to argue for why the enemies of the Japanese Empire had to be eliminated. You can agree or you can disagree, but we want to have the message out and understand that Japan was being criticized by the United States, being criticized by many in Europe for not recognizing human rights, for not recognizing prisoners of war and their rights. And it took the Japanese a long time to catch up in this battle of understanding. The Japanese badly wanted to be modern, they badly wanted to be recognized as modern, and yet they were committing the kinds of atrocities for which they would be held accountable at the end of the war and later on as well. The Republic of China learned some of the tricks. This Republic of China in 1911 began to emerge with a new soldier, a new military figure, new uniforms, and you can see here that the Chinese who are wearing queues are being executed for their criminal behavior, for robbing and stealing, but they lose not only their queues, they lose their heads in this battle. And so in this context, the Republic of China, as of 1911, began to pretend to try to argue it was serving the mantle of the Meiji Japanese and learning to create a new world within which officers were dressed like Europeans, acted like Europeans, and fought in the wars between different groups in China in the 20th century at the same level that the Japanese fought as well. In other words, the Japanese became models. Models for the Chinese, models for the Koreans, models for the Vietnamese, and then in Southeast Asia, models for the Thais, models for the Burmese, and many others as well. Remember, they were throwing the Westerners out of Indonesia and liberating Indonesia in the Japanese sphere of influence. So a lot of things were going on that we need to be aware of. The treaty was signed, and you can see the treaty was represented in different kinds of ways. The Manchu Chinese are bowing, their American advisors are bowing, they're not very comfortable in bowing, and the Japanese don't bow an inch. We all know that that can't be possible. We know the Japanese are a bowing culture. Culturally speaking, they bow when they meet, they talk to each other, greet each other, invite each other, they bow and ultimately acknowledge the other's presence. Here we see their warriors on ships and on land, simply cold, hard-headed soldiers who kill what's in front of them and ultimately take advantage of the limited culture behind them. The Qing doesn't even know what's going on. Li Hongjiang is seated. His American advisors are talking and exchanging opinions with Ito, Mirabumi, and others of the Japanese team. Note the Japanese are dressed in European-style generalissimo uniforms that augment their status, and Li Hongjiang hardly knows what's going on, at least in the picture. Similarly, on the ship in the line of the Zaldo Peninsula, the Japanese again are showing their superiority culturally in this battle as well. One of the more realistic pictures of Li Hongjiang meeting his Meiji counterparts, however, is this one. Some of you remember your history. Remember that Li Hongjiang is a man of about 6'2", 6'3", a large, powerful figure, and the Japanese anarchists had tried to kill him when he came to discuss the treaty in the 1895 era. And the Japanese had been held responsible for that, and ultimately had to be responsive to that. In many ways, they made the strictures of the war, the results of the 1894-95 war, somewhat less onerous. Not much, but onerous enough that the Chinese would argue that they had shown some respect for Li Hongjiang, who was injured, fortunately not seriously, but he survived, and that use of that moral purpose forced the Japanese to concede that they couldn't get away with the execution or murder of a Chinese diplomat, a Chinese ambassador, without having to taste the music publicly. So here they began to, in many ways, bring honor to Li Hongjiang, and I argue that Li Hongjiang was someone that they would honor even in this treaty. Now, what happened? Why had China failed, and why had Japan been successful? We have been debating these issues for well over 100 years. The Jiao Zhanzhang is just over 100 years ago, 120 years ago or so. We're still debating was that Japan was open to change, the rapidity of westernization, the samurai traditions versus the civilian ideal of the Chinese rather, the lack of corruption, science and technology, governance, supply lines, all of these became debatable in this period of time. And slowly but surely, the arguments began to appear that the reason the Japanese had won was because they had used the weapons at their disposal in their full power and in their full understanding. The Chinese had not understood what they were doing. The other side of it, which is a more cynical reading, is the Chinese paid for the war with Japan, that the Japanese were beginning to win in Russia and elsewhere, and that from the Sino-Japanese War forward, they are giving to Japan over $3.8 billion in silver for the Japanese economy to use. What would an import of $3.8 billion do to your economy? If you were a Japanese Navy, and you could begin to see the investment as a funny place in warfare in this period of time. And you can argue many things happened, but one of them that happened is the Qing dynasty paid for its loss. It paid for money for the boxers, it paid for money for the losing of the war to Japan, and it also paid for giving up the Liaodong Peninsula to the Russians, the Japanese, the Russians, the French, and the Germans, and later paid for it to go back to the Japanese. Money was talking in this arrangement. Let me now break away from those kinds of facts. I will not try to answer particularly whether the Hongkong supply lines were corrupt. The general consensus is the bombs that his Shanghai manufacturers made didn't have any firepower. They were filled with cement. They never exploded. And this was one of the reasons that the ships that the Chinese sent into battle were powerless. They were used with only cement-laden vessels that landed on the Japanese ships but couldn't blow up on the ships, as we saw they would in the Japanese films of their victory in that period of time. But still, what we see overall in this narrative is China's failure is obvious, whatever that might be, and Japan's success is obvious, whatever that might be. And I think you could all see there are a number of arguments that we could make about the two positions, but that it's not as easy and obvious as it was before. Let's take another look at perhaps World War II in this period of time. An American painter, Mark Tansey, has painted the triumph of the New York School in 1984 and attributed the victory of the United States in the Second World War to art. In many ways, New York became the cultural capital of the world because the Germans and the French and others had destroyed themselves, and now everybody was coming to the United States. The United States was now the leader of art and culture. We have this painting as a symbol of warfare. Warfare determines power, and therefore Japanese warfare determined power, and their cultural values were dominant in this framework. The Americans are on the right-hand side. The Americans are on this side, dressed in World War II uniforms, and the Europeans are in World War I uniforms, maybe the side of the United States. And here warfare is presented as an artistic war, with the Europeans falling to the Americans on fighting above ground rather than inside the earth, and ultimately the Americans above ground with weapons and machinery fighting for this battle. This is based on a kind of a collage that the painter borrowed from the newspapers. So these were actual newspapers of the Second World War. These were actual newspapers of the First World War. And what he did was he put them together and painted them in message on. So there were actually scenes of the battle. But this battle was in the 1940s, and this battle was in the 1910s, 15, and they were brought together in the battle against each other. Here we have, in this context, the different American artists here: Harold Rosenberg, Jackson Pollock, Frederick Lindbergh, fighting against Pablo Picasso, Henry Matisse, Salvador Dali, who doesn't care at all, he's smoking and having a good time. The Americans are very serious, hands in their pockets, saying it was inevitable that we would win the war. It was obvious. I simply bring this in now so people say, well, how did we win the war? It wasn't art, was it? Well, what was it really about? What was the war about? From the Japanese point of view, it was our culture, our values that were superior. You can see that the United States argued that way, at least in these paintings, in the storyline after 1945, when the United States became the new cultural center of art and power. Again, I'm not saying that this is the way it happened. These are interpreted facts that are being presented in interesting ways, but we would, in many ways, argue that in part it was a cultural war. This is the justification. I'm sorry, it's not as readable as possible. This tells us the abstract expressionists, in many ways, had become the leaders of the artistic world, and that the abstract expressionists were now saving the world in the new museums in the United States, in New York City, and elsewhere in the world. So the artistic victory of abstract expressionism is justified in this military manner of argumentation. Here we have more clearly what the argument was about in Japan. Ernest Fenollosa and Kenshin started writing books about Chinese and Japanese art history. And now suddenly we begin to see that they were arguing that Chinese history was failing and Russian and Japanese art history was successful. So the battle had now gone from the battlefield to the cultural war in this context. So in this initial discussion, the decay of modern Chinese art, already foreshadowed by the middle of the Ming Dynasty, is most conspicuous in pictorial art, and all forms of art, in fact, involve time and imagination. It's an odd view of art, odd view of art history, and it's very pejorative because of telling us something about Ming art and Ming values, and yet this was the way it was produced. Here's the one American, the Japanese, saying, we adopt any high universal test of aesthetic attainment, great spacing, great characterization, and the structural use of great color, we shall find modern China painting to have fallen almost to the childish point of awkward weakness and ineffective symbolism. The same point to which the European Christian art fell to in the poorest of the Byzantine mosaics. The only hope for the hopeless is to perceive itself to be hopeless. We may then come to discard it and to get anew. Let us not really lower our critical standards to suit the degenerate present. No one would accept that as art history and historical accounts today. And yet we can see that this is being carried over in the Boston Field Museum as an argument for why Chinese art is inferior to Japanese art. Note how the metaphors have gone from the battlefield and ships and navies to art and culture. We begin to see a cultural front behind which the Japanese are superior and a cultural front behind which the Chinese are capable of seeing what modernity requires, what modernity expects. We've been trying to put this together for well over 50 years to understand how these interpretations were accepted as objective, impartial characterizations. We now recognize they are not impartial at all, and their characterizations are self-serving and in many ways not just innocuous, but pointless in terms of their agenda. This is the kind of thing we see in our political world more recently as well, but we can begin to see that as of 1910, 1920, this was the view of the Sino-Japanese world, where Japan's leadership was automatic. Audiences accepted it. This is the San Francisco Chronicle, using many of the depictions of the Chinese loss in Korea. You note that these are paintings and drawings, woodblock prints being brought on the front page of the San Francisco Chronicle to explain what was happening at the battlefield. Note that the woodblock prints are now serving a different story. Try a Roman Shaw movie here. Put the movie in moving motion, and you could say the news is Roman Shaw, one soldier defeats 100, standing guard against all the others in this situation. So we can laugh and see this as humorous today, and that I agree we should. We can also see that this is being used in a peculiar kind of way to justify a fact, justify a position, a world of why we are what we are. And we can go back to this image of the little samurai and the giant king, and we can begin to see something's going on in the inversion of the king and the samurai with the British observer. They're not seeing anything that we see from these different discussions. These are practiced minds presenting a situation for punches with time, for punches humor, and that's very questionable in these situations. We begin to see other kinds of cartoons emerging that become very, very significant in this battle between whose Asia is it. This is a French cartoon in 1890. You can see the Russians are trying to get Korea. Qing and the Japanese are also waiting for Korea, and Korea begins to be the object of their appetite, the object of their needs, and this is a French cartoon. A new member of the Imperial Club of the World, note the Japanese dressed to a T in suits, but wearing geta. Geta used, of course, one of the most primitive forms of going to the bathroom or cleaning up in the outhouse or wearing around the back of the yard. The Japanese seem to be culturally sophisticated, but the geta gives them away. They don't quite understand what's going on in this situation. In the the First World War, German, British, French impresarios are beginning to judge the Japanese by their values, by the cultural situation as well. Another French yellow peril. 500 years ago, it would have been the Mongols that were the danger. Here we begin to see it's the Japanese. And the Europeans are scared of the Japanese and the power that they will have in the Galapagos Peninsula and other parts of Asia as well. You can begin to see the tutelage of Korea. Ito Hirobuni, who is a very short man, is tutoring the royal family of Korea, and hopefully the royal family son will become the king of Korea. Of course, he will not. He will be removed, and Korea will become a colony of the Japanese. You can see the Meiji Emperor representing more and more imperial and powerful after this victorious war, and the Japanese being accused of being imperialists in honoring, like themselves, the imperial world that they are constructing and putting together by tutoring and then destroying the Korean Republic land. So again, these are being used as images. Not all the images agree, but there's certainly a kind of repetition to them, and we begin to see the cultural wars are very complicated. We have to be very careful that we are not taken in by the images that we see. We need to sort of step back and ask, what are we seeing really when we see these kinds of images as presented by Americans, presented by Koreans, presented by Japanese, and others as well. These are humorous pictures in some ways. These are the royal tombs in 1920 under control of Japan. The Yangban elites of the Joseon dynasty are dancing away with nothing more frivolous to do than just living out their lives with the pensions they received from the state at that time. In the United States, John Fryer, a major translator of science and technology, begins to sort of in 1895 try to understand the future of China. He spent 30 years of his life translating books and materials into Chinese from science, mathematics, astronomy, and different fields of physics and chemistry. And he argues that in many ways, the future of China is grim. It will not survive, the language will fall, and that in the end, only the fittest will be surviving, and English will be the learned language of the world, of the empire. Well, certainly we all know English, and we all know these things are happening, but Putonghua hasn't gone away. It's been reinvented in a new sort of language based on a Beijing dialect, and in many ways, the languages that were used in this period of time are still thriving and doing very well. Fryer was there, he was a citizen, he saw the things that were happening, and his conclusion were in many ways the kinds of things we see from the frameworks of the competition, the victory of the most powerful. Sooner or later, the end must come, and English be the learned language of the empire. It seems to be only the fittest can survive. It may take many generations, but in the end, it'll be this way. This is social Darwinism, cultural Darwinism. He presented as the argument for why the Chinese will fail. And why is Fryer writing this? Because he's accepted an appointment at Berkeley. It's called Berkeley College then. Will become the University of California at Berkeley later on. They've offered him a position to teach Chinese Oriental studies at Berkeley, and he will bring all his books and materials. And the reason he's leaving is because the end of China is due. It's coming soon. He's getting out. He's going to do a new kind of thing. I don't blame Fryer for this kind of thing, but he didn't know what he was seeing. He didn't know how to evaluate or adjust it. And in the end, to his credit, he began to disavow many of these statements and return to trying to open up the Shanghai translation groups, open up the different kinds of schools and translations they were dealing with everywhere else, and maintain the Chinese language that he modeled at this time. You can see Darwin became a window through which to see one's victory. And Darwin could be used to stress your strength and ability. Note the costume that he's wearing. This affirms him as a Qing Dynasty official with a high position in this context. Again, it's not that he doesn't know. He knows very well, but he doesn't quite understand what he thinks he knows. Carry it a little bit forward, and we jump into the 20th century, and we have to figure out, well, what happened with China? And one of the most important arguments that has emerged, starting with Joseph Lito, but it's certainly not his fault, is China has no science. And this is an argument that many of us in this audience here have taken for granted and argued over and over again. Our teachers argue this, our previous generation teachers argue this, that in many ways, as Feng Youlan said in this particular framework, what keeps China back is that she has no science. The effect of this fact is not only plain in the material side, but also in other sides as well. The last I knew, Feng Youlan was a great philosopher. I wasn't aware that he was a great historian of science, or that he was a great historian of other kinds of historical matters in this context. So what was he doing in turning that science is the reason for the rise of the West and the failure of China? And I would say that in many ways, science is power, science is agency, and science is technology. Having those forces under your control, you'll be able to do things that no other people can do. But in many ways, Feng Youlan has turned from a philosopher to a historian of failure in this context. And since this framework, many of the May 4th scholars in Europe and in China accepted that argument from the May 4th forward, saying, we have no science, we must have science. We have no medicine, we must have modern medicine. And you know the generational stories through the 20th century, how this was upped over and over again for the way to save China and ultimately to make China more practical and more powerful in the world today. Feng Youlan was taken in, and he says there's no science. Well, we'll now have to go through an exercise. Was there really no science in China? And I guess 20, 30 years ago, I would have an audience that would say something else. But I think with an audience like this, 20, 30 years later, none of you are fooled when someone says China has no science. None of us have to accept that. Similarly with the paintings and the like, we don't automatically buy into the interpretation that this was how it was read, this is how it was being placed on. We see that there's views of events that are being forced upon us, that if we don't guard ourselves against them, we will be victims of their images, that we will be using their images as normative when they're not normative at all. They become negative, scapegoating particular groups. I don't blame Feng Youlan for any major damage at this point. He was one of many who were trying to come up with the key to China. And the reasons why China never developed science became a very humorous collection of facts and theories. I don't need to read them all through to you, but Chinese have no concept of God. Therefore, you can't have any science. The Chinese don't use data, they don't use theory, they only use data in this context. Linear perspective they don't have, only the Europeans have that. The Chinese language is too arcane, too complicated. All these have been used. We know in the computer world of language, China is becoming a dominant player in the translation of terms and objects and writing forms using computers. No concept of investment, anti-military conceits, denigration of military values, all of these things are coming up. I used to teach this to my students. I'm old enough to look back on the two generations, and now I recognize that I misled the generation of students into misinterpreting the kinds of issues of science that they were facing in China and elsewhere. China had no science, no medicine. How foolish of us to accept that, but we were predisposed to accept it. We thought that that was the way we had an answer, an explanation. And I'm in many ways trying to break down the answer and come up with something that will allow us to better understand why we failed to understand what happened, rather than trying to figure out what these events mean in the victorious in their narrative. We need new perspectives. One of the things we need to sort of understand is the 19th century and why it was such a complicated period of time when things were happening throughout much of East Asia, particularly in China, Japan, Korea, and elsewhere, and Europeans were bringing and also learning from things that were happening in East Asia. And that East Asia was a very important feature that made possible the advent of the world that we see today. But why hadn't that been included in any of the discussions? Why didn't we talk about it in the discussions of the coming and the beginnings of the Sino-Japanese War? We have the turn toward the Great Armada of Zheng He. He was the great savior of the Ming Dynasty. See, we had ships in the early Ming. They got all the way to Africa, and therefore the Chinese had a great navy. They didn't see anything. There were no enemies, and they basically destroyed the navy and built the Great Wall. Almost an interesting American story for building walls. This situation. The wall situation will do any good here? Of course not. But nonetheless, the turning to the Armada, 1421 by Admiral Menzies, an English writer, writes 1421 as if the Chinese had discovered the world in 1421 and then forgotten the world by 1450. How that happened. We begin to have, well, we have kinds of science fiction narratives. But the one I would start with now, having put you through a story that ends in 1895, let's go back 300-400 years. Let's look at another example. And that example begins in 1592, the Imjin War. the Ming China fights with Korea against the Japanese. Hideyoshi, the warlord ruler of Japan, in 1592 and 1598 marches into Korea to conquer China and India. Very modest man in this period of time, trying to take the entire world. And in this context, the Chinese Ming Navy allies with the Korean Navy, whose Major Admiral Yi Sun-sin is very famous in Korea. There's no admiral after that, but nonetheless, he joins with the Ming Navy to destroy the Japanese Navy and its forces. It's a very different story than 1894-95. 1894-95 was Japan. 1592-98 is China and Korea, and they're only 3-4 centuries apart. If this is the beginning of the story, how did this fall apart? That's another narrative. But we need to deal with this narrative to begin with to understand what happened in this period of time. Is there anybody in this room that has not heard of the English ships in the 1588 efforts of the Spanish to conquer and take the North Sea? You're all aware of that story. Something you get in your schools, in your educations, to know that 1588, Francis Drake and the others were facing off the Spanish Navy and ultimately had to fight for control of the sea in this period of time. So this one is relatively well known. If we put this within the context of the Sino-Japanese-Korean warfare, we can see equal numbers of ships, similar technologies, and ultimately similar battles going on in this period of time. Clumsy and inefficient gun mounting on Spanish ships is an interesting view. And then ultimately, we begin to see that in this outcome, who gets Taiwan? The Manchus. They began to sort of use the Zhejiang junks for trade in the 17th century, and Chinese merchants and others are using these new ships for trade from Ningbo to Nagasaki, and the trade between them continues to grow. Korean artisans and technologies are drawn into Japan in this period of time. Porcelain is emulated, movable type is emulated, and the Japanese go into a period of semi-seclusion. Compare Japan in 1900, full power, able to conquer at will. And here we see in 1598, into the 17th and 18th centuries, the Japanese are happy at home. There aren't any great warriors. Most of them are getting bankrupt, paying for the bills they have to give the merchants in the economic system, in the Sankin Kotai system of alternate attendance that the Japanese live within. For 2.5 centuries, the Japanese are living in a closed world that has enclosed them in a framework where they can't conquer Korea, they can't conquer China. What's happening in terms of China? This is the famous admiral. These are the ships of the Koreans. And this is what happens to China in the 18th century. This is a growth industry. China is taking over much of what was once the Ming. The Manchus are taking over the rolling areas, moving into the Liaoning Peninsula. They're bringing in Tibet, and they're bringing in much of the Dzungars and the Uyghurs and others in Central Asia. And China will get, the Qing will get Formosa, nobody else will, and Korea is going to be brought into this framework as well. The Koreans will send 300 emissaries to the Qing dynasty in the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries. So what I'm saying in setting up the structure this way, I'm not answering your questions, but I'm giving you the sort of the funny question of what happens in the 1580s or 1590s, and then suddenly by the time we get to the 1890s, the world has changed again. We have to be able to explain both of those. We have to explain the rise of Japan and the fall of China in the context of where we once explained the rise of China, we must give credit to the Manchus in their efforts to reunite the New World in East Asia that is a boundary of the continent of China today. China today is not the Ming Dynasty. China today is the Qing Dynasty geographically on land and sea. And it's increasingly trying to put forward a larger claim of all of that. But I'm simply putting up an argument to say, how do we get from the 1590s to the 1890s? And what happened? And what happened to Japan from power to weaker power to finally a power that has to watch everything in the 19th century and ultimately try to figure it out on its own. This is the world of Japan, the Sea of Japan in the north. The fears of the Russians are coming in from here. Ultimately, the Russians will come in later in the 1940s and take these areas over and never return them to Japan. And to this day, the Japanese want them back. They've had negotiations with the Russians over several decades, most recently last year, and the Russians say, no, we like Sakhalin, we like the Northern Islands. We took them into warfare and square, and you lost them. And we're going to keep them in this world. So if North Korea is a problem, so is the warfare between Japan and Russia a problem, there's no peace between them on their boundaries. They continue to be in a warlike situation. Mentioned in the White House, mentioned in the issues that are going on in Russia. No, the Japanese premier recently visited the Russian leader and tried to negotiate, and they shook hands and they smiled and they drank. They got no further. These conundrums remain in place. Everybody wanted Taiwan. The Dutch wanted it, the Portuguese wanted it, the Spanish wanted it, the English wanted it, and in the end, a bunch of rebels against the fall of the Ming came in and threw the Dutch out, and then the rebels were defeated by the Manchu Navy. Simply. No big deal. And ultimately that was the first time that Taiwan became part of the Chinese Empire. It was under the Manchus in this period of the 1680s. You don't go around asking, why didn't the British get Taiwan? Why didn't the Japanese get Taiwan in this period of time? Why is it the Manchus took it over? We just ignore that question. When in fact, it's a sign of a particular power basis that links the Fujian province to an older group of peoples brought in by the Dutch in Zeelandia and elsewhere to bring these two areas together. They had never been brought together before politically. Again, the drawings of Zeelandia. This was the Dutch dream. The Dutch dream blew up when Koxinga took back Taiwan from them. It was called Formosa, of course, Treasure Island, not the area. The wood blocks that we begin to see in terms of printing in this period of time. These are wood block prints from Korea, metal type, that they pioneered in the Song Dynasty, 1100-1200. Later the Japanese began to borrow printing and building the metal type that the Koreans had in a later period of time. But in many ways, printing in China was old hat. They had been printing since the 11th and 12th century, and the Koreans had been printing in the 11th and 12th century. The Japanese printing Buddhist materials for the most part until the 17th century, but only in the 17th century would they get into a commercial publishing kind of regime that would lead to a new world of learning and writing in that period of time. Production, China had no technology, China had no industry. Well, the problems with that in terms of ceramics are legion. Millions and millions of tons of ceramic material being sent to Asia, to Europe and the New World in this period of time. These are the kilns. Many of them are drawn in China, called the Lunggao. But these were built on the side of a hill. Heat would rise in them, the various objects would be placed in them. This is a Korean kiln based on the North Chinese model that we see in this period of time. Millions of pieces are coming out in this period of time. And the Japanese are learning from the Koreans how to build these kilns and how to make these kinds of new forms of ceramics in this period of time. The economy here will be learned from the West based on their knowledge of China and Korea rather than having it inside out, that everything comes from Europe. The yakimono of Korea here has its applications for the kind of stone pottery of Japan. These are overlaps of a voice, some sort of discourse of continuity in the making of porcelain. The Yangban elites. Again, here are the official charts of the officials in marching. These are the reconstructed temples, throne halls of the Joseon dynasty that were reorganized after the Japanese were thrown out. And these are the Yangban who are again biding their time, dressed with their hats, dressed with their gowns, waiting for some sort of new Korea to emerge, which has not emerged as yet. Giving you other examples, no science. This is a 1525 provincial civil examination from Jiangxi in central China, and it's about astronomy in the capital. This is 1525, and they're trying to figure out how come we're off by one day. How come when we predict the new year, predict the last day of the month, we're off by one day? What can we do? The Mongol calendar had been very constructive and very useful, but in the end, it didn't get very far, and ultimately, in some ways, this is now asking for help. This is 50 years before the Jesuits come, and they're saying, let's get an answer for this. And the Jesuits will be coming later on to help answer these questions. But it's sitting there in the middle of a 8-legged essay kind of examination. It's not supposed to be there, yet it is there. And we have to ask ourselves, why in 1525 are they testing students in this area? It's an ingenious essay. Once you mark it up and once you look at its punctuation, you can begin to see that this is a very sophisticated argument about astronomy, the calendar, and mathematics in relationship to that, to solve equations, to solve problems, to deal with these issues. We used to think that they were just waiting at the exams for nothing, that they were all just literature people. This was their examination content. Learning, selection, Daoxiao or Neo-Confucianism, the rulers, their George Washingtons and their Abraham Lincolns, we know about them, world ordering, economy, statecraft, ruler official, national defense, classical quotations, law, military matters, literature, poetry, national study. What's wrong with that? This is the eight-legged essay of death and destruction of the entire Chinese culture, and then we see that that's not at all what was going on in these issues. Why? Because we didn't learn that we needed to read all the examination papers, not just the 4 books and 5 classics chapters. We had to look at the policy questions. And the policy questions come in the hundreds to explain what the Chinese and the Manchus and others have thought about their options in this period of time and before. We just refuse to acknowledge it. This is Suzhou in 1759. This is the Yamen, the working office of the major the government of Suzhou, and we're giving an exam. This is in 1759, and Qianlong Emperor is visiting Suzhou. And if you visit Suzhou in 1759, you're going to see Chinese being examined. The examiners are here, they keep track of all the people on the outside, and here the candidates are writing, and here the chief examiner is here. This looks like the SATs almost. Things that we have to learn about this situation. Here the books and the manuals are all available, and they keep it in and out. And of this group of several hundred examinees, probably 30 or 40 will be allowed to go forward for the next level of the exam, the provincial exams and later the national exam. Why didn't we take that into account and leave that out of the story? In astronomy and the like, we see the drawings of the exchanges between the Chinese and the Jesuits and others. We see that this is Western technology dressed up with dragons in the organizational forms of cosmetics. The cosmetic of the production is taking over the technology, but presenting it in a form of symbolism, the dragons and the like, the dragon power of the throne, showing who's really in charge, politically. We get the numbers right, we also know who's in charge of the numbers, and ultimately come up with an answer for that situation. Similarly, Korea, China, and Japan have similar astronomy traditions, and these so-called European machines, ecliptics and others, are being used by all sides to deal with God. This is an interesting picture of the world. It's dragons all the way up and down. And then the sphere, the celestial sphere of the globe, is something that people accept more and more, except that, of course, what we're not working about is the news, Copernican views of the universe, which the Jesuits are not passing on, because they don't believe in Copernicus either. They fear Copernicus. They don't bring it forward. But nonetheless, you don't see any sense of failure here per se. Trevize is introducing the technologies, and it's being accepted by the state and being used as necessary. Again, these depictions of the astronomy bureaus in the areas of discussion don't show any decisive failure there. Here we have some Jesuits talking to the Kangxi Emperor about the nature of the globe. There's no sense within which this French image is showing who's in charge. This is an exchange between the Emperor and his French minions, and they're talking about what the real globe should be. And the Jesuits believe in a world where the Earth is still the center of the world. They'll change their mind in the 18th century, as will everyone else, but here it's a unity of knowledge that we present in this discussion. And they have a word for science. The science of investigating things and understanding principles is really what this talked about. This is the tectonic celestial sphere, which the Jesuits introduced. Note that the sun is at the center. And then the sun is at the center of these orbits, and then they all go around the Earth. So the Earth is still at the center, but the sun goes around it. This is at least less of a failure of the older system, but it still is a failure of the new system as well. Again, exchanges, all of you know the frameworks of McCartney missions to China. McCartney was going to open up China for the trade of the Europeans, particularly the English. And here we have a Qianlong era tapestry of the English coming to an audience with the emperor. If you ever saw where we have those images of the rulers, because in Qianlong looks like a fat old man who was just wallowing on the ground for the most part here. And he's his followers are sitting there very thoughtfully looking at the effort of the English representative to figure out, do I bow? Do I koto? Do I get down on one knee? What do I do? That became a huge debate between the British and the French. Look at the faces of these guys. They're horrified just by the reality of seeing these people exchange, and it's vice versa in this exchange. Is that what was going on when they were going to bring gifts for the Jesuits and gifts for the different missions coming in the 1790s and 1820s? I don't think so. These are bad representations of events that are going to be carried on in the 18th and 19th centuries in many different kinds of ways. This is a world of fear rather than a fear of figuring out what's going on. These are British machineries that are brought in the 18th and 19th century, put to work in the Imperial Palace. And we begin to see the different kinds of machines emerging. Watt's steam engine. Remember, we began with the great steamboats and the steamships. The steam engine, Watt's, goes back to 1774, and in this context, it's being used for lifting water out of the bins of the holding coal in the way. The coal buns are covered with water. They have to drill the water out, so they need these machines to draw out the water. We can begin to see the orrery from the 18th century, self-moving with the urgent center. This is another British machine shown for the cases. And we will end with the Macartney paradox. All of you have heard that Macartney came to China and he offered them the new world, the modern world, and the Chinese turned them down. Chen Lung said to Macartney, we have everything we need, you have nothing for us that we don't need. Well, it's interesting who helped him decide that. The Jesuits were in the court, and of course they didn't want the Chinese dealing with Protestants. They wanted them to deal only with the Catholic Church and the Jesuits in this trade. So in many ways, they convinced the emperor they didn't need any of this stuff, and that the Jesuit materials were better. But he did say something that was quite remarkable. Dinwiddie was the astronomer on the ship, and he went to Guangzhou near here, and he the English factory that had been set up. Macartney, in his own notebook, said, had Dinwiddie remained at Canton and continued his courses, I dare say he might have soon realized a very considerable sum of money from his Chinese pupils alone. Because they were seeing the steam engines. They saw the uses for them, and they ultimately were sent down to Calcutta, and in Calcutta, these new forms of mathematics and new forms of astronomy were being used in this context. Macartney knew very, very well that had he been able to get to the mercantile establishments in Guangzhou, this is before Singapore, before Hong Kong was available for the country, there had been clear recognition that the Chinese would welcome these new machines and these new frameworks if they got the right presentation. So in this context, we want to understand the engineering fruits of the Industrial Revolution after the Russian War are not as obvious as we think, and also how quickly the Chinese and Japanese learned the new techniques of warfare. By the time of 1894-95, Chinese had full battleships, full destroyers, and all kinds of weapons available to them that they had not had before. Okay. That's where I want to end. I go over my time. So in conclusion, I will simply say, we need a new history. We need a new history that is going to take in what we've learned here in terms of misrepresentations and ultimately getting it wrong. But we also need people to understand that we can't take for granted the positions of people who have stakes in the game, who have horses in the race, and are going to use that for whatever is purpose. The larger fact, the larger theory that will stand is the one that recognizes the limitations of the theories and limitations of the facts that are being invented in this entire period of time. And I think there are hints for how we might want to do this, but I think we need to sort of deal with a new history of China from 1592 to at least 1892 for starters, before we move on from there. Thank you very much. Any questions here?
You can also raise some question and move on. With Elman, I think it's fluent in all these languages. If necessary, Cantonese, and then I understood. All right, so that's start the Q&A. I think there's a question over there. Professor Elman, could you also introduce yourself?
Oh, yes, Dr. Chen from Baptist University. Baptist University, yes. Are you hinting at the Industrial Revolution as a turning point? Because just right before the Industrial Revolution, kind of came as China is still dominating not only East Asia and maybe the whole Asia. But after the Industrial Revolution, especially your last picture of the box, the steam engine, are you hinting at that as the turning point of the 19th century?
I think the Industrial Revolution made a big difference. Why England became leaders in that difference has to be explained as well. Although the Germans and the French and others were catching up only after the Napoleonic Wars before they catching up. But something's happening in Europe, happening in terms of the mathematics and astronomy, and it's certainly pushing things forward, but ultimately leading particular events in England to cut across the grain. Also, eventually learning that the competition between England and China was the vestiges of the treaty of treaties in 1815 and later when the English were regarded as the leaders of the European world at that point, colonizing India, leaving in many ways the New World up for the Americans and others to take over. And I think there's a new game in town, and I think we need to understand how the British affected that. Some of it comes from the Opium War, and I think we need to sort of understand it as well. We also need to understand that the Chinese and others learned the technological tricks very quickly, that they had these machines very quickly, they had major navies very quickly, but something else may have been missing. And some of it may have been political, some of it may have been social, and some of it may well have been technological. We need to sort of sort it out, to sort of make more sense about it. But I do think the riddle is in the Industrial Revolution, what happened in Europe and what happened in China.
Thank you. Okay, there's a hand in the corner over there.
May I ask in a sort of a comparative question? So it's really well known the dynamics between the three places, Japan, China, and Korea, is full of conflicts and tension throughout history. I'm just curious to what extent we can find a similar case elsewhere in the world which can be informative to really cast a lens to interpret the dynamics in East Asia as well.
I'm not sure any exact dynamic is available to us. We can sort of look at the English island off the coast of Europe and you realize how the conquered ones and then resisting conquest many times after that is a very special story of maintaining one's autonomy and use of that even today to sort of get out of Europe, keep Europe from remnants. I think there's some possibilities there, but the scale is never the same. If you look at the scale of what the population of China is, what the population of Korea is, what the population of Japan is, we see that Japan is larger than France in this period of time. It's only smaller than China, but the 25, 35 million Japanese are roughly comparable to the 25 million Frenchmen in this period of time. So the scale of the comparisons really tilt the balance toward what's happening in China, Japan, and Korea, as opposed to similar kinds of things that's going on in Europe. But I think the best one is really when you try to compare Japan and England to being islands off the major continental powers, and how that gives it some distance from what's happening, but also choices to bring in what they want, keep out what they don't want. So I think that's one very fruitful one. There certainly must be others that I'm sure are going to provide us.
All right, I think in the middle there's a gentleman.
Good afternoon, Professor Elman. I am a history student from the Hong Kong Baptist University, and I would like to ask about the position of Korea in the lecture, because you haven't mentioned much more about the position of Korea. Do you think is it only a transfer of the Chinese culture to Japan, or the transition between China and Japan, or does it have a unique representation towards the cultural transfer in Eastern Asian societies?
I think it's pivotal being between Japan and China. And there are numbers of things that happen in Japan that would have been impossible without Korea being there and being traded back and forth. So the 1590s is a period when Korea is an opportunity for Japan, and in the end that opportunity fails, but they bring back Korean different traders, manufacturers, printers and the like to help the Japanese update their printing industries and update their other abilities that they force them. So I think it's important in that period of time. I think we also need to sort of understand what are they fighting over. They're not fighting over Christianity, although it becomes important in this period of time. They're fighting over the classics. They're fighting over who are the real sages, and ultimately what do the Koreans have to tell us about what the real Buddhism is, what the real Chinese Confucianism is, what the Taoism is. They're fighting over what it stands for. Another example might be, for example, calligraphy. The forms of writing that the Koreans use are borrowed from China, perhaps, but in its most ancient forms in the Han Dynasty, many of the models seem to be more realistic of the time than Han Dynasty models, which are not available in most museums. We see in so-called reproductions of earlier models, so not necessarily the case. So I think, had I spoken more about it, the uniqueness of Korea in the midst of an unusual framework of having two very dominant powers on each side. It can't escape it. It has to deal with it. It's been going on since the medieval period, when the states ultimately defended themselves from within with the Civil War, and the common armies came to bail out Silla, and then Silla had a hell of a time getting rid of the armies after that. The Chinese don't get out. They stay for a while. So it's a complicated story, and I think we need to sort of bring more and more of Korea into the story. I sort of apologize for not doing it, partly because of time, but I think we need to sort of really begin to understand what happened to Korea after 1592. It never really restored itself to the vibrancies it felt in the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries. It faced the destructions of Hideyoshi and others, and never really recovered into the late 19th century when it became suddenly available as an object of conquest. It seems to have lost its agency to exist. For example, with the navies that fought with the Chinese against the Japanese in the 1590s, the Korean admiral is well known and very famous, and the ships and their building is very, very prominent. What happened to that admiral and that navy as we move into the late 19th century? There are no records of a Korean navy. There are no records of a Korean admiral. We see that the Koreans are relying on the Manchu state for their so-called defense against these other arenas. And that lasts against Japan into the late 19th century, but not afterwards. But I think you're right to say that we can't just leave Korea sitting there in the middle as the apple to be devoured.
Okay, any more questions? Mr. David Ford.
Thank you for the significant reminder that we should be rewriting the history. Strongly support. But I also have the feeling, you see, on one hand, yes, we'd be very Eurocentric, looking at China's progress in life, where the Europeans have been excelling. On the other hand, one could go too much the other way and put up the case where China's had it all along. And we've had that argument for a long, long time too. And the common ground seems to be that at the end of the day, we've got to be able to locate those specific points in time, the critical changes that might have made the difference. I mean, for example, and I have a sort of sense, maybe you didn't have enough of those in the story. But you showed us pictures of the astronomical instruments that came in from the West. And I've looked at these things in museums and I've often wondered how the Chinese reproduce the precision, engineering, the very fine cutting and measuring that had to be done in order to produce the gauges that they fitted into those machines. And I've often wondered, how on earth could they have made those things if they didn't apply the same technique to other things such as chronometers and eventually the steam engine. So you know, is there much of a history you can tell me about that technological aspect of precision engineering in the 18th century, where Europe was making great advances?
You're absolutely right about precision, and the requirements of precision changing over time with the notches that are there. One example of how precision can move backward and forward, when the Chinese in 1525 were testing themselves for their calendar, why were they 1 day off? The Europeans at that time were testing their calendar, they were 10 days off. They were having to have a Copernican revolution and ultimately have to configure how they're going to figure out what happens to meet those 10 days. So the Chinese are more precise on the calendar, more precise on the instruments that they're getting from the Mongols and others into the 17th and 18th centuries, then it begins to fall behind. And along with some of what we use as rhetoric, the Industrial Revolution required preciseness. Newton, when he took his equations and put the numbers in there, they had to be exact. Ultimately, the weapons that were being created in the navies needed that kind of precision, and it took them a long while to manage those stages of precision. At some point, it was good enough. In the 18th century, having relatively poorly degraded terminologies and notches, they could get by with that. They got by with worse before, as long as they redid the observation. But in the long term, if the Industrial Revolution is going to be pushed forward, the equations have to measure something exact. And ultimately, the flow of the water, the flow of the metals forming with each other, the battles that are being fought over these kinds of machines have to be precise. Carry that to the atomic nuclear weapon, we begin to see how important precision begins to be operative. If you look at what happened to New Mexico in the 1950s to try to build the nuclear weapons and the like, most of the time nobody knew what was going on, and they damaged and killed lots of people in the midst of trying to figure out what are the effects of doing this with nuclear weapons. So over time, the precisionists wasn't aware of it, and they had to catch up with it very, very quickly to be able to deal with it. So I think you're absolutely right about, at what point we begin to force even more precision onto these things. And I think the metaphor of linking it to technology and the Industrial Revolution is certainly part of that as well. If you've got the Newton, you've got the equations, and you can put in the numbers, you build accordingly. That's the rise of the engineer out of the artisan. And the artisan is good enough up to a point. The porcelain is exquisite, but in some cases the Japanese will begin to have different kinds of furnaces. They don't depend upon the kinds of chemicals that are around in one particular area. They can begin to use all kinds of turf and ground to make these kinds of so-called stoneware and other options. But I agree with you that we need a better story and narrative for the growth of these fields. And one of the things I didn't do today is talk about the terminology for, does the Chinese have a word for science? They talk about it. What's interesting, the term that they used to translate science before the Japanese kagaku was gojur, and ultimately that term was fixed into the narrative, beginning with discussions about medicine and astronomy in the 11th, 12th, and 13th century. When they translated many Jesuit texts into Chinese, they always put gojur at the end of them to say the science of the nature of these particular moments. So there are things that are very, very important in this that we need to sort of enhance that argumentation. With the gojur narrative, I didn't have the time to do that today. When you look at the history of text to show how we slowly but surely see the Chinese and others talking about this way of dealing with the world and dealing with problems as gojur. And then later, if you go to Shanghai, the gojur shuyan is available at that time. And gojur, as a term for science, lasts until the early 21st century. The early 20th century, I'm sorry.
Well, I think I see the hand. Francis at the back.
Hi, good afternoon, Professor Elman. I'm Francis Lee from the Hong Kong's Maritime Civil Society. I'm very interested in your sharing about the inspiration of Korean ceramics to Japan. I think during the same period, it was the job of Sano Niku, the tea master of Hideyoshi, who promote the using of Japanese celadon and Japanese made ceramics to substitute the bowls, the mogu bowls imported from the Song Dynasty. It was a paradigm shift, I think. What's your opinion on that view?
I would kind of agree with you. I myself have not done the work with the research on that. I think we do need answers for why, what happened with these printers that were brought to Japan and these makers of celadon that being brought to Japan, and why the celadon moment in this context seems to be very important. We need a clearer answer about printing in the Song Dynasty vis-a-vis Korea and China, and the Koreans were competing and making movable type more prominent in terms of their printing technology. So I think we need more and more of where had the Chinese done certain things in ways that the Koreans didn't necessarily follow, or do different kinds of things, and how are they learning from each other in each kind of way. I was mentioning calligraphy. We can see the new forms of writing seal script and other kinds of script with a Japanese backstory, with a Korean backstory, sort of get a different picture of what the terms, how they were written, the different styles that they used, that the Koreans had imposed. So the Kitchen Hui that I talked about yesterday had a clear sense of that in terms of trying to get clear about the possibilities of producing things that they could do with the mathematics that they had at that time. So I think we need a clear answer for that. Some of the Japanese scholars that we are working with are doing this already in Japanese work. We need to acknowledge them as leaders in the understanding of mathematics and the issues vis-a-vis Korea, we, particularly in the West, are not equipped to teach and to deal with as well as we should. A good deal of Korean history is now still about Neo-Confucianism. That was true about our writing about China in the 1950s and 60s. Neo-Confucianism wiped out the so-called Shi, the Kazhongxue, and the complicated technical means of getting knowledge. And we need to see that the Koreans were doing many, many different things. And I think their mathematics, one of the stories of Kim Chung-Hui is that some of the interlocutors in China are asking him for an early reading edition of a book on mathematics. It's been lost in China. And Kim Chung-Hui finds it and gives it back to Ranyan. And Ranyan immediately publishes it. It's turned into the major key volume linking up what had happened in the Mongols to the transformation of mathematics into the 15th and 16th centuries, based on the Daishu, the so-called primers of single unknowns, Kenwon-shu, and Suyue-shu, 4 unknowns for equations. The Koreans were leaders in many ways in dealing with counting rods for solving those kinds of equations. We know what they do with abacus, but with a counting rod, you could similarly handle equations to several unknowns, to several columns, and keep track of it, even though you didn't write them down line by line, the machine would allow you to do that. So you're at a good point, and we need more work like that. And I think perhaps the best way is to make sure that people realize the Japanese scholars are working on this and have made a lot of progress in seeing the dimensions of mathematics as similar but also different in the way Japan, Korea, and China interact on these terms. So my plea is, in many ways, we need to do precisely what you're suggesting.
So, any more questions? Okay, at the back of college second one.
Thank you, Matt, for a very informative lecture. And I would like to comment on science in China, since I'm a chemist. In fact, it's not my comment, it's a comment from Professor Henry Boland, who was a professor of physics at Johns Hopkins University, and also he founded the American Physical Society. He said China had science, but the Chinese place too much attention on application of science and not in science itself. And then he went on to comment that gunpowder was invented in China, but the Chinese used gunpowder to make firecrackers and also fireworks and use it at war, and never explore why gunpowder exploded. And if Henry Boland said if the Chinese really search why the gunpowder exploded, China would have invented the science of chemistry and also the science of physics. So I think we had science, but we never place our attention on science itself. We use science only. That's actually a comment from Henry Boland.
Well, I think the argument is often the same for the Europeans. If it works, they follow it, deal with it, and the answers come much later. I don't think it's quite that simple, and I think what's going on with the Chinese, with gunpowder, for example. Gunpowder is being used on ships fighting the Japanese pirates already in the 15th, 16th centuries, and ultimately the Manchus conquered much of the Ming Dynasty with its walled cities by bringing in cannons and blowing walls up. Another form of warfare in Europe. So there are certain aspects where the guns and the cannons on ships and on land are making a big difference. And arguably, the Manchus could not have conquered North China without their ability, using Chinese artisans and the like, to build cannons and weapons of mass destruction to do this. So I think in some ways it's more than just having a game during Chinese New Year, or during the Lunar New Year. It's more not. There's more to it than that. But organized with the kind of precision that we see in Europe, perhaps not, although it depends on the situation. But I think it's not quite that simple that the Chinese just turned the gunpowder into a game of enjoyment. That it had technical military applications. Clearly, when Li Huzhang complained that most of the weapons that they were firing from his guns were filled with cement and not gunpowder, well, they weren't going to explode, and that was a problem of corruption, not knowledge. And they had to have a framework where the Shanghai artisans and engineers were lying to them about the makeup inside these weapons, and that they were cement. Heavy, useless cement that could make damage, but couldn't explode. So it's a complicated story. But I agree with you overall that in general, the fixation has to be more exactitude. It will take a long time to build a system of exactitude to the limits necessary in a modern world of post-Newtonian mechanics and the need for exact figures pumped into your equations. That takes a while.
Okay, David, follow-up question.
I mean, to put some flesh on the same argument, exactly gunpowder and chemistry. I mean, in the 18th century, you had in France Lavoisier, who was in fact building arms for the French Revolution. And he was the same guy who was interested enough to experiment with what explosion was about. You know, so they had a proto-theory behind it, you know, phlogiston and all that, which probably is a lousy theory in many ways, but it stayed on for a long time. So to put some flesh on Henry's question is, why would you have a phenomenon like Lavoisier, who's a practical man of affairs working for the revolution, trying to make armaments, being interested in an experiment of what phlogiston was about? What's the equivalent of that in China?
Well, there is equivalent if you look at medicine. And what we have in many ways are firing medicines, producing medicines, millions of kills, millions of medical places creating different kinds of compounds, whether they use yin machine or they're doing different kinds of framework. They are testing applications of the firing and bringing them together. And ultimately, a lot of Taoist medicine, a lot of traditional medicine is based on creating these formularies in this context. So if they were using Bunsen burners, they were testing the frameworks of what they thought was yin machine in these theories. But the theories never reached the maturation point where it mattered that great deal. They could come up with a concoction that cured you, and you argued yin machine was the reason why it worked. It cured you, but that may not have been a good reason for why it worked. And you were happy with a lesser argument that ultimately explained everything, explained nothing. So I think that's a complicated story. But the stories of explosion, if you can imagine how many pharmacies there were in traditional China, either 150 million in 1600 or 200 million by 1650, 1700 or so. There's millions of these kilns, millions of these sort of Bunsen burners inside these medical shops that are producing medicine. It's not, they're not thinking about weapons per se, but that's available for the cannons in the largest of the battle. So I think if we look more carefully at what kind of chemistry was involved in using yin machine for making medicines and how they went about dealing with it, and when they could argue that it worked or didn't work, I think it's a parallel kind of argument.
But would that push that even a bit more? I mean, when Lavoisier did his experiments, and we put a chemist there to prove to be wrong, what he did was to overthrow the phlogiston theory. So this was a theory accepted for 2,000 years, and coming up with oxygen said, but that was wrong. Now, did your experiments with Chinese medicine overthrow yin yang machine? Yes, did they get to the same way?
They did exactly. In the end, they couldn't replace it with a better theory. They did argue that the yin yang machine explained everything and therefore nothing. We're better off just empirically looking at what works and applying what works and come up with perhaps explanations later. But in the end, there's a revolt already internally in the 17th and 19th century. You can't use the yin yang machine for explaining it. So there's a phlogiston theory. In effect, it's a joke. We're not going to use it because that's only to sort of explain theoretically something that we don't care about theoretically. We want to be able to cure people. So I think that there is a kind of a match. That said, we need to know why Chinese prioritized these in this particular way, why they didn't carry over situation. I'd be interested in seeing what the Europeans are doing for medicine at the same time that they're playing around with phlogiston. With the illusion that somehow the Chinese have to do experiments. Try to imagine 300 million people living in a world that needs medicine and the sophisticated doctors producing the pharmacies for this medicine. And ultimately come up with concoctions that have traditionally worked for whatever reason. That's a fair assessment. It's a balance sheet. It doesn't say why chemistry in one area is going to be the same or different in another. We need to think that through.
Well, I think time is running out, so we have the last question at later date.
Good afternoon, Professor. I've read your article on Sinopharm and Sinopharm in Tokugawa, Japan. So I would like to ask if you think that the semi-seclusion policy by the Tokugawa Bakufu is relatively advantageous to them if you compare the experience of the Koreans at the same time. What do you think of the difference of their development?
I think they have advantages by being islands off the coast, off the mainland, as England was. For England, that failed once or twice, depending if you count the hunters, the Vikings coming in. With regard to Japan, I think it was a voluntary choice in many ways to close down shop and to realize that we're not going to conquer Korea, we're not going to conquer China, we're certainly not going to conquer India. We need to get back into our own framework. And then through unexpected, explaining social arrangements and economic relations, we begin to have a system that works of its own inside, with selling silver to a world market, mainly gobbled up by the Kangxi Emperor and later Emperors Chenlong, who begin to take Japanese silver and pay back the Japanese in gold. So that economy is there, and ultimately both sides can live with it, even though they have no diplomatic relations. So I think it's there. We need to think through that much better. For example, when the Chinese in the 1590s come through to help the Koreans fight against the Japanese, the Chinese come in with all this silver. And they give it to the Koreans and they say, this will pay for the services. We're going to get food, water, we need provisions to help you guys defeat the Japanese. And in certain cases, the Koreans are saying, we don't use silver. Why are we going to use silver? So in many ways, you have to start over again with the situation. The Koreans catch on very quickly. And Tsushima Straits begins to be a medium of exchange of silver from Japan to Korea and then on to China. But in the beginning, there's no need for silver because they don't use it in their economy. So I would say yes and no. Again, like so many of the questions that you're pointing up to, I don't have the exact answer. I think what we are trying to do now is get closer to understanding why the previous answers don't work. Or if they do work, there are limitations are involved and how we go on from there. Simply for 1592 to 1892, I'd like a lot of things to be thought through. I left enough holes in the argument that you could march through with fire trucks to try to throw the water on the fire. What I'm certainly saying is we've had such false answers, such wrong answers, and wrong-headed approaches that we are too smart now to be sucked into that again. We need to sort of think about it more carefully. So every point that you have all raised deserves follow-up, per se, to see what happens. The metaphor of Japan on the outskirts watching what's going on in China may work with England sometimes, but it doesn't always work. It must be other. My sense would be the Japanese didn't want to be isolated, but they wound up being semi-isolated by their own terms and requiring a silver market to maintain their own status. But out of that came a very dynamic economy. Who would have expected it? Japanese medicine was very sophisticated. We wanted to test on how certain kinds of drugs worked after being produced. The Japanese were on top of that. And they also attacked yin-yang wuxi, this hopeless theory, useless phlogiston. But we need to sort of understand, so what happened then? How does that work if we recognize it? So I feel very humbled I can't answer all of your questions. But I would say I'm waiting for a generation to sort of put all these up for observation and say, well, what's going on with phlogiston in one case and with making medicine in another case when fire is clearly what is needed. The Chinese have been masters of fire since the copper and the bronze implements of the Shang and the Zhou. And that carries on into porcelain making. And it would stop with gunpowder? I'm not sure. I think we can't make that too simple. But they were masters of iron for over 2 millennia before we begin to take that achievement away from them. So I don't have answers, That's why I want to, anyways, bring forward the questions. And for someone at the end of my career to be coming up with questions rather than answers is a good lesson for me.
Well, with that, I think we can conclude, I think, today's lecture. And let me take this last opportunity to do a little promotion. I think since our discussion, or the questions, some of them, most of them focus on science and the history of science and technology development in China. And Professor Benjamin Elman's book, I think, published by Harvard University 10 years ago, has been translated into Chinese by 中国人民大学. I think this book is not ready in our bookstores yet. I think we will receive from Professor Wang Jingyi today, I think, some copies. So I'm putting up an ad here, and then for those who are interested in science, technology, the history of China, please, I think, be aware the book will be available soon.
Let me add that it's not enough to sell the book, but it's I have to say the state of the field. My hope is those of you who are interested in the state of the field will go further.
And also your new challenge to rewrite, I think, pre-modern East Asian history in a new perspective, maybe comparative perspective. I hope some of you will take up the challenge, including yourself. I think the good reversal that the book will be, I think, coming out, I think, I hope sooner than later. And maybe also Professor Fo and other colleagues could also take up the challenge. All right, with that, I think we like to conclude the
Thank you, Professor Elman and Professor Lord, for this inspiring lecture, and thank you all again for coming. Professor Elman will deliver one more lecture at CUHK next Wednesday, so please feel free to come again. You can find the details of the lecture in the booklet. And lastly, please help us fill out the questions to the box and the reception counter outside the lecture theater. Thank you, and look forward to seeing you again in the future. Goodbye.
Thank you.